Bom dia a todos.
Bom dia.
Bom dia, que Jesus possa envolver os nossos corações em muita luz, muita paz, entendimento dessa doutrina. Hoje nós vamos ter o estudo com o nosso querido Peter Reis. O estudo vai ser em inglês, tá bom? Mas antes disso eu vou fazer a leitura e também a oração. E no finalzinho a Beth vai fazer um poema para a gente, que é de ano novo, né? E também desejando a todos um feliz ano novo, né? Começou agora e a gente já começa com o pé direito. Com os dois pés melhor, né? O esquerdo e o direito junto, para não cair, né, Tetê?
Sim.
Então vamos lá. Civilização e reino de Deus. Interrogado pelos fariseus sobre quando viria o reino de Deus, Jesus lhes respondeu: não vem o reino de Deus com aparências exteriores. Está em Lucas, capítulo 17, versículo 20. A Terra de hoje reúne povos de vanguarda na esfera da inteligência. Cidades enormes são usadas à feição de ninhos gigantescos de cimento e aço por agrupamentos de milhões de pessoas. A energia elétrica assegura a circulação da força necessária à manutenção do trabalho e do conforto doméstico. A ciência garante a higiene. O automóvel ganha tempo e encurta distâncias. A imprensa e a radiotelevisão interligam milhares de criaturas num só instante, na mesma faixa de pensamento. A escola abrilhanta o cérebro. A técnica orienta a indústria. Os institutos sociais patrocinam os assuntos de previdência e segurança. O comércio, sabiamente dirigido, atende ao consumo com precisão. Entretanto, estaremos diante de civilização impecável? À frente desses empórios resplendentes de cultura e progresso material, recordemos a palavra dos instrutores de Allan Kardec nas bases da codificação do Espiritismo, perguntando a eles por que indícios se pode reconhecer uma civilização completa. Na questão 793, constante de O Livro dos Espíritos, deles recolheu a seguinte resposta: reconhecê-leis pelo desenvolvimento moral. Credes que estáis muito adiantados, porque tendes feito grandes descobertas e obtido maravilhosas invenções, porque vos alojais e vestis melhor do que os selvagens. Todavia, não tereis verdadeiramente o direito de dizer-vos civilizados, senão quando a vossa sociedade houveres banido os vícios que a desonram, e quando viverdes como irmãos, praticando a caridade cristã, até então sereis apenas povos esclarecidos, que hão percorrido a primeira fase da civilização. Espíritas irmãos, rememoremos a advertência do Cristo, quando nos afirma que o reino de Deus não vem até nós com aparências exteriores. Para edificá-lo, não nos esqueçamos de que a doutrina espírita é luz em nossas mãos. Reflitamos nisso. Uma lição bonita, né? Para começar o ano. Bom, vamos então, primeiramente, agradecer aos mentores que prepararam a nossa casa para nos receber hoje, agradecer a Deus, nosso Pai, Jesus, o nosso Mestre, que nos ensinou tantas coisas, nos advertiu de tantas coisas. Senhor Jesus, obrigado por tudo que nos deu, por tudo que nos dá e por tudo que ainda vai nos proporcionar. Senhor Jesus, abençoa esse dia, abençoa o nosso palestrante do dia, o Peter, que ele possa atrair para ele os bons fluidos e nós possamos ser os maiores beneficiários, que nós possamos absorver cada palavra, cada ensinamento do nosso mestre e guardar no nosso coração. Obrigado por tudo, Senhor. Obrigado aos mentores dessa casa, aos trabalhadores, e que assim seja, graças a Deus. Peter, now is with you.
Okay. How are you all doing?
Good.
Good. Well, we're in a new year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everybody. Because this weekend was so close to the New Year's holiday, I thought it made sense to give our numerous dedicated speakers who do palestras in Portuguese a little more time to get ready for palestras as we move forward. So next Sunday, for instance, we'll be back to our palestras in Portuguese. But today, I'm going to inflict English on you. False Christs and false prophets is inspired by chapter 21 from the Gospel according to Spiritism. And really, it's about a warning. And when we think about our spiritual progress, it is our personal responsibility to guide the journeys that each and every one of us is on. In other words, as we develop, we begin to use more and more of our discernment. We study, we learn, we make lots of mistakes. In the beginning, because Spiritism stresses we're born simple and ignorant, we're not as responsible. But as we learn more and more, we become more responsible. And part of what that means is that we also need to learn how not to be gullible. In other words, in English, when you say gullible, you mean that you're easily fooled. You just want to believe what someone tells you. You want to believe a false prophet, so to speak. Now, when Jesus,
Okay.
When Jesus says, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. When Jesus says this, it's in Matthew chapter 24. At the very, very beginning of Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is down with some of the apostles at the Second Temple, which I'll tell you more about in a bit. And he predicts that the Second Temple is not going to last. It's going to get destroyed. Then, when Jesus, with the disciples, is up on Mount Olives. Mount Olives, if you ever go to Jerusalem, Mount Olives, there's a very large cemetery, 3,000 years old, and it overlooks the view of Jerusalem. So Jesus is up on the top of Mount Olives looking at Jerusalem. And this is when he elaborates and warns the apostles about false Christs and false prophets. And what he's basically telling them is that the times that they live in are very unstable. And they have to be on their guard, because when times are unstable, this is when people come forward and say, I have all the answers. Okay. So in this presentation, I'm getting used to I don't have the animation working, that's all right. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on a few things. I want to focus on the prophet's mission. And again, this is inspired by chapter 21 of the Gospel according to Spiritism. Jesus' famous saying about a tree is recognized by its fruit. Great signs and wonders of false prophets. Do not believe every spirit. That's a comment from the Apostle John. And finally, just a few comments from the instructions of the spirits in this chapter. So the prophet's mission. What is a prophet? Well, a prophet, we tend to think when we hear the word prophet, maybe this is someone who's capable of predicting the future. And that's true. The prophet Daniel, for instance, one of the major prophets in the Hebrew Bible, did predict the future frequently. Jesus certainly could predict the future. Jeremiah at times predicted future events. But more importantly, a prophet is somebody who instructs, who is bringing forth information from the God. And the prophets, during the time of the Hebrew Bible, where many of the prophets come from, they were speaking on behalf of God. At least that's how it was understood. And they were usually warning with the intention of instructing. So again, real prophecy is when people are sent from God to instruct their fellow human beings. And in doing so, they're revealing certain things that are currently hidden to humankind. So prophecy is a way of revealing and deepening our understanding. So in terms of where the prophets come from, I'm going to give a little history. About 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, roughly 3,000 years ago, a major king was King David. King David was a king who was entrusted and was in harmony with God during the entire time that he was king. But also King David was the one that was entrusted to set up the United Kingdom of Israel. The United Kingdom of Israel is currently in present-day Israel in the Middle East. It also makes up parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria and Jordan, and so forth. And what happened was that the United Kingdom of Israel was set up under King David. And this is around the year 1010 BCE, 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. And what happened is that David set up the tribes of Israel, and then his son Solomon became king after David passed. And Solomon was the one that actually built the first temple. David did not build the first temple because David, in order to set up the United Kingdoms of Israel, he united several tribes and so forth. It was a rather bloody conflict, and David had a lot of blood on his hands, so God felt that Solomon should be the one to build the temple. So Solomon builds the first temple in Jerusalem. Solomon reigns for 40 years, just like his father David, so there's relative stability. And generally speaking, these two kings follow God. However, near the end of Solomon's reign, Solomon started to move away from God. Why? Well, the Bible tells us that Solomon had 700 wives. Can you imagine? 700 wives. And yes, it was common to have more than one wife in this time period, but 700, assuming that's an accurate number. But anyway, Solomon had wives from other cultures and other nations. And they would come in and they would bring in idolatry. Idolatry was a general problem that the Jewish people struggled with. Why? Because Judaism introduced monotheism to the world 5,000 years ago, more or less. The idea that there's only one God, which must have been very strange to people because people were used to worshiping multiple gods, idolatry, and so forth. That's what they were used to. The idea of an invisible, all-knowing God, it took time for people to get their heads around this. And there was a lot of rebelling against moving in that direction. But David did believe in following the God, as did Solomon. Solomon was a great king, very wise, built the second temple, really solidified the United Kingdom of Israel. But then, near the end of his reign, as he was much older, his wives started to have more influence who wanted to bring idolatry into the kingdom of Israel. And so when Solomon passed, this was emerging as a greater conflict. And then what happened was that Solomon's son, the grandson of King David, was asked if he could maybe not have such a heavy taxation for those who lived in the north. And he basically was counseled against increasing the taxation. So he decided to ignore the advice he was first given, which was you can decrease the taxation. So Solomon followed the not so good advice, you could say a false prophet in this case. And what then happened is that the people in the north said, we're going to separate, and they did. And then we have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And these two separate kingdoms last for centuries. Now, generally speaking, if you look at in the Christian Bible, we call it the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible. So the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, it's also called the Tanakh in Judaism. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that's all the Torah. And then the rest of the book is made up of history, it's made up of poetry, it's made up of wise sayings and so forth. The prophets as well. And in the Hebrew Bible, it follows the history of what happened. And there's basically in First Kings and Second Kings, First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, there's this ongoing struggle of kings who are either following God or they don't follow God. And the prophets are brought in to try to warn the kings of what's going to happen if they don't follow God. Well, to make a very long history short, the northern kingdom was made up of one king after another who basically disobeyed God. They followed idolatry. And finally, what happened was that the Assyrians overran the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, 700 years before Jesus, and wiped it out. About 150 years later, the same thing would happen to the southern kingdom of Judah. The prophet Jeremiah, for instance, who I will say more about in a moment, was warning the king at the time that this is going to happen if they keep disobeying God. Well, they ignored him. And what happened was that the southern kingdom of Judah was overrun by the Babylonians. Babylonians are in the area of present-day Iraq. And the Jews were exiled to Babylon, to Iraq, basically, nowadays Iraq. And they were there for over 50 years. And there are many lessons to be understood about this. This is basically, Spiritism would understand this as cause and effect. When you start disobeying God repeatedly, you're not in harmony with God, you sort of go off and do whatever you want. When you choose to be stubborn, then what can happen is that you stop having protection. So the way it was understood in retrospect was that the kingdom of Israel was lost, completely lost, because they kept breaking the covenant with God. The covenant with God, again, Judaism introduced monotheism to the world. So with Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, down to Moses and so forth, the covenant with God was established. But then in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, there's this ongoing conflict between following God, keeping the covenant with God, or breaking the covenant with God. And finally, breaking the covenant with God was happening so frequently that God allowed the Syrians to invade the north, the Babylonians to invade the south 150 years later, and that was pretty much the end of the kingdom. And then people realized, we really messed up. But the other message in all of this is that God gives us a second chance. And the Jews were allowed back into Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah 50 years later. And to make a long story short, they finally rebuild the temple again. The temple is the Mecca, the major place of worship, which I'll say more about in a bit. So chapter 21 quotes Jeremiah, chapter 21 from the Gospel according to Spiritism. It quotes Jeremiah by saying that to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you, filling you with vain hopes, they speak visions of their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They say continually to those who despise the word of the Lord, it shall be with you. And to everyone who stubbornly follows his own heart, they say, no disaster shall come upon you. This quote from Jeremiah, again, Jeremiah was one of the major prophets. Put very simply, there were a small handful of major prophets, and then there were several minor prophets in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. The difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets was not about necessarily the message, it had to do with the length of the book that's attributed to them. So Jeremiah, for instance, has a much longer book, so he's considered a major prophet. Again, Jeremiah was warning the king of the southern kingdom of Judah, you keep following idolatry, we're going to lose this country. And then Jeremiah lived in 586 through the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah, and Jeremiah himself was exiled to Babylon. Now, Jeremiah, in this passage, which is mentioned in the Gospel according to Spiritism, he's basically warning against those who were saying, look, don't worry. We can keep following idolatry. We don't have to worry about, listening to this guy, Jeremiah, or worrying about following the word of God. If we can do whatever we feel like, everything's just fine. And Jeremiah was saying everything is not fine. And then finally, the Babylonians came in. There's a book called Jews, God, and History, which also elaborates a little bit on what the prophet is about. So it says the prophet was above the seer. The seer is somebody who can see into the future, and was above the priest because the Jewish people implicitly believed that their prophets were men sent by God to show man the path to righteousness. The prophet in Jewish history was concerned with preserving the purity of the Jewish religion. This led him to the field of man's moral corruption and to the ideas that the Jews, who were the chosen people of God, must set an example for the rest of mankind. So the point is that the role of a prophet is to remind people what it means to really follow God in the first place. Again, Judaism introduced monotheism, and then Christianity comes from Judaism, which I'm sure you all know. All of the early Christians, Jesus, the apostles, all of them were Jews. And Jesus was not overthrowing Judaism. He came to uphold the law, but he was also emphasizing the ministry of love. But it's rooted in Judaism. And the prophets, whom Jesus certainly respected, were reminding the people of their time. And there were many different prophets throughout the period of the kingdom, of the history of the kingdom of Israel that I mentioned, both before and after the kingdom was lost due to following and disobeying God's will. So, a tree is recognized by its fruit. Oh my goodness, yeah, the formatting got messed up, I'm afraid, so I apologize for that.
Just in the beginning.
Yeah, okay. Jesus says before a crowd in, this is in Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's chapters 5-7. He basically is warning the public, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. This is very profound in a number of ways, but Jesus is basically asking all of us to ask ourselves, or at least look at what we do. How do we spend our days? How do we spend our time? What kind of fruit do we produce? It's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? To think about, what am I actually doing every day of my life? Am I doing something that produces something worthwhile? Well, yes and no, probably for all of us. But what Jesus is also saying is that it is our actions that matter, not what we say. People can be very profound, they can promise all kinds of things, but it's what they do that you have to pay attention to. So when a tree is recognized by its fruit, in other words, what is the quality of the tree producing the fruit? What is that individual really like in their heart of hearts, so to speak? What is their deeper self really like? Is this somebody you can trust, or is this somebody who promises everything and then does something very different? Is somebody honest, trustworthy, or are they a hypocrite, and so forth? Now, Jesus says this publicly. Then, privately, you remember I mentioned at the beginning that Jesus went up to Mount Olives, and he had just predicted that the second temple was not going to stand much longer, which again, I'll elaborate on in a moment. But the prophets then, when they're up on Mount Olives, would like him to elaborate a little bit. So what he says to him is, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. I'm reading to you again something I read before. And they will lead many astray, and many false prophets will rise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will increase, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. What Jesus is doing is he is saying to them, the times are very tenuous, they're very unstable, and you need to be as grounded as you possibly can. And you also need to use discernment as much as possible. He said, because lawlessness will increase and the love of many will grow cold. He knows that in the era that his ministry is practiced, things are kind of a mess, for instance. But he also is commenting about Jerusalem. If we look at that quote I just read you as mentioned in chapter 21 from the Gospel according to Spiritism, I'm going to share with you a few things that Jesus says a little bit before that quote, which are not in chapter 21, which is that if you go to Matthew chapter 23, because the quote I just shared with you was from Matthew chapter 24, at least one of the sources, Jesus laments, in other words, he feels badly that Jerusalem is the city that, quote, kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. Then he says, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Jesus is quite aware that Jerusalem has a very long history of people being stubborn, not following God, ignoring the prophets, sometimes killing the prophets. Again, what was the role of the prophet? The prophets were frequently trying to tell the truth, and people don't like it when you tell the truth at times, especially if you're in a position of power and you feel threatened. So the prophets like Jeremiah were frequently got into trouble, were persecuted, there were attempts to kill them and so forth. And Jesus is also commenting about what's going to happen to him because he already knows what's going to be coming. Now, when he mentions prophets that were killed in Jerusalem, it is understood that he may be referencing a prophet named Zechariah, who was murdered in Jerusalem, because he mentions between the sanctuary and the altar. It's a reference to probably the prophet Zechariah, who a few centuries before, again, like the other major prophets, or prophets in general, was trying to warn the king not to follow idolatry and not to break the covenant with God. And the reaction was they just killed him. But Jesus also confronts the Pharisee in this same way by saying to them that you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. When he says you witness against yourselves, he's basically saying to them that you're not being honest. When we bear witness, part of it is we are observing, we're participating, but we're also taking in, we're connecting to the word of God, following a spiritual path that will lead us along the pathway of good, for instance. But he's also confronting the Pharisees. Now, Judaism in this time of Jesus was pretty rocky for a few reasons. We have, you know about the Pharisees, right? Because they're mentioned frequently in the Gospels. There were the Sadducees. The Pharisees were the pretty much the ones that ran the Second Temple. They were more the religious leaders. The Sadducees also ran the temple, but they were kind of the elite of the Jewish sects. That was the second Jewish sect. The third one would be the Essenes. They were out in the desert. The Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1947 were from the Essenes. And then we have the Zealots. The Zealots were the radicals. And the Zealots were the ones that really, all of them were not happy with Roman taxation. But the Zealots were the ones that actually wanted to try to overthrow Rome, or at least somehow rebel against the Roman Empire. And when Jesus foretells the destruction of the Second Temple, what he's really talking about is a reference to what was going to become the Jewish rebellion. Jesus was probably crucified in 33 AD. The Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, so within less than 40 years after the time of Jesus. Why did this happen? Well, a couple things. Jesus references the prophet Daniel, and it's a reference to the prophet. Daniel was a prophet in the Hebrew Bible, who there's a passage attributed to Daniel. It's referred to as the abomination of desolation, in which Daniel is predicting the likelihood that the temple will be destroyed. This was after the temple had been rebuilt, which was around the same time of Daniel. So things were looking good, but then Daniel also predicted that this would happen again. So why was the Second Temple in 70 AD destroyed? Because of the Jewish rebellion. I mentioned the four Jewish sects. The Zealots in particular were the ones pushing to try to rebel against Rome. The historian Josephus, who lived a little bit later, but it was a contemporary of a little bit after the time of Jesus. Josephus pointed out that the Romans didn't govern the area of Jerusalem very well, so that was one problem. And the other problem was that you had people like the Zealots, who were the radicals, who were really trying to overthrow the Roman Empire, which they didn't have a chance of trying to overthrow the Roman Empire, but they tried anyways. It started in 66 AD, lasted 4 years, very bloody conflict, and then finally the Second Temple was destroyed. Now, Jesus predicted this was going to happen, so again, it's an example of prophecy, but he also mentions to and some remembered this, don't get involved in this conflict. If this conflict starts, get out of Jerusalem. And some people did, and they were spared. Part of what the significance of the destruction of the Second Temple was that it began what was called the diaspora in Judaism, which basically meant that Judaism scattered. The Second Temple used to be the religious Mecca, if you will, the major focal point of religious practice. And it was governed and controlled by the high priests. One of the significances of Jesus's ministry is that we all are invited to have our own relationship with God. We don't need an intermediary. And it's revealing that after the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, it was never rebuilt. And nowadays, there's, I'd say most Jews have no desire to try to rebuild another temple, even if they could, because, we have synagogues all over the world and so forth. So the idea was that humanity was changing because we didn't need to have an intermediary between us and God anymore. We have our own relationship. And part of what Jesus's ministry of love emphasizes is that we have a direct connection to God. But of course, when we have a direct connection to God, we also have more responsibility. So what are some great signs and wonders of false prophets? Well, I want to go back to a variation on a quote that I read to you before, in which Jesus is warning about false Christs and false prophets. And what he emphasizes in this quote from Mark, again, a variation on the quote from Matthew, is that the false prophets can lead people astray, even the elect. What do we mean by elect? Those who have some knowledge, like the apostles themselves. We could translate it into, say, a spiritist. Let's say we've studied the codification, we go to center, we participate, we work on trying to improve ourselves, which is why we're all here, and we learn a great deal, but then somebody comes along and is able to fool us. And this can happen for a very simple reason, because we don't use our discernment. We always have to, again, recognize a tree by the fruit that it produces. What somebody says may be impressive, they may sound really good, and they may be fine, but you also got to watch what that person does over time. Also, chapter 21 in the Gospel according to Spiritism begins to also talk about the way phenomena and the ability to do miracles, so to speak, might be carried out. And when we talk about the difference between a good prophet, someone who's a real prophet, somebody you can trust, versus somebody you may not be able to trust, what chapter 21 emphasizes is that God does not give perverse beings a power equal to its own, and that the circle of supernatural facts narrows as the circle of science broadens. The gospel, according to Spiritism, is stressing the importance of science. The Spiritist codification in the 1860s, and starting with the Spirits book in 1858, is a product in part out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment started mainly in the 1700s, the 18th century, and the Enlightenment was encouraging people to think more for themselves and not just follow blindly what leaders tell them to do. And the Enlightenment was also about rational thinking, using discernment. Modern science, as we know it, started about 400 years ago, more or less, and it really was starting to flourish more and more. And with that, people began to think more differently. And what chapter 21 in the Gospel, according to Spiritism, is stressing is that as we expand our knowledge of science, we can also use that to question what we call supernatural acts. During the time of Allan Kardec, there were a lot of stage shows. People would go to the theater, people would levitate tables and do all kinds of things. And maybe sometimes it was genuine, but there was also a lot of trickery going on. There was a lot of stuff that was just fake. So people would fake phenomena because it was entertaining, but people would believe there was something going on here. And of course, part, as I'm sure you are familiar with, Kardec was trying to emphasize, look, you need to study this stuff and realize there's nothing miraculous going on here. These things can be explained. So there was an emphasis on science. And again, it's emphasizing why science, along with philosophy and religion, is equal in Spiritism. So the more we increase our scientific knowledge, then the more we can also use our discernment to recognize when somebody, in this case, is manipulating phenomena in some way to try to fool people, or in English you would say mesmerize people. People can be easily swayed in a variety of ways, and so the more we use our discernment, then the more we can really question what somebody claims is true. Section 4, do not believe every spirit. This is a reference to the first letter of John. The Apostle John was the youngest of the apostles of Jesus, and he's the only one, it's believed, who actually lived to old age. Most of the others were martyred one way or another. By the time the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, Paul was gone, Peter was gone, and many of the other apostles were gone. But John was probably passed around the year 98 AD. And he is, this quote attributed to John is mentioned in chapter 21 of the Gospel according to Spiritism. And he's basically warning not to believe every spirit. So Spiritism understands this as more, this is the part of chapter 21 that's focusing more on the area of mediumship and what kind of messages are we getting from the other side. Because he says, many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. So those who believe that Jesus is, ushering in a new era, then they are following God. That's part of John's message here. But he also, chapter 21 starts to, as I mentioned a moment ago, starts to emphasize a little bit more that we have false prophets who are incarnates, but then what about disincarnate spirits that are also false prophets? And what chapter 21 is emphasizing is that they, in many ways, are worse, in part because we may not even realize what's going on. It says that Spiritism was able to help bring this out. In other words, to recognize when we're being misled by spirits. The Medium's book gives all kinds of categories of different ways in which spirits can be deceptive. So the Medium's book, this is in part a reference to the Medium's book, that spirits can be deceptive, hypocritical, proud, and they can pretend to be, it says falsely sage, meaning they can pretend to be wise, but they really are not wise. And the ways in which we can easily be misled by spirits, it can be a very subtle process indeed. So how to recognize genuine versus false prophets? Well, the first one is beware of anyone who claims to have an exclusive monopoly on the truth. All of us are doing our best to understand ourselves, to understand the world around us, but we all are limited in our knowledge. And sometimes people act as though they have the exclusive claim to truth, so to speak. A dark example would be, I remember once somebody saying, be careful of those who are convinced they're absolutely right. And then he went on to say the Nazis thought they were right. So we always have to use our discernment when analyzing what somebody is saying. Again, major theme in chapter 21. And it says, this is again another reference to a tree is recognized by its fruit. Remember that each and every being bears on its forehead, but all in its deeds the stamp of its greatness or decadence. It's hard to know anybody that we have regular contact with, but part of what this is asking us is, can we really see somebody clearly enough and deeply enough to know whether or not this is somebody, to really understand where their heart is? Is this somebody we can trust, somebody we can follow? Also, chapter 21 is emphasizing that when humanity is going through transition, beware of schemers who pose as reformers and messiahs. This happened during, I mentioned before, the United Kingdom of Israel, how it separated into the north and south, and then eventually through a lot of not only not following God, but through lawlessness, society became unfair, people were not treated well. It was a gradual turning away, and this created times that were very unstable, and yet sometimes people would come along and say, I have all the answers. And so somebody, whether it's in the past or even today, somebody who comes across promising they're going to reform everything or promising that they're the Messiah, the second coming, so to speak, then we have to be careful. There's a reason why Spiritism is not about following a single individual. We have a lot of veneration for Allan Kardec as the codifier, but we don't worship Allan Kardec. The knowledge of Spiritism is decentralized. In other words, it comes from a large group of spirits. We don't exactly know who, and it doesn't matter. What matters is that the content is truthful, that it stands the test of time. Also, when somebody can be very charismatic, persuasive, and it looks like they have a mission, and maybe they do. Mahatma Gandhi, yes, had a mission. Mother Teresa, yes. Martin Luther King, yes. But sometimes people who have a lot of ego come along and they seem to have a mission, but then you have to, again, look at what they're actually doing. But the point that chapter 21 also stresses is that important missions are only given to those who are truly capable of carrying them out. So again, if somebody appears to be on a mission, they may very well be, but we have to observe that person closely enough to make sure that they really are able to carry out the mission. One way to understand that is that a lot of times people who are on a genuine mission are very humble about it. They don't really, they may not even have full awareness that they're on a mission. Because if I come to you and say I'm on a mission to save all of humanity and help all of you, what am I doing? I am displaying my ego and my arrogance and perhaps trying to convince everybody of how wonderful I am. But if I just move through my life, go about my business, but I'm helping people and I'm not looking to draw attention to myself, then that's more of a sign of a genuine mission, because that genuine mission is rooted in humility. It mentions also, true missionaries of God must justify their mission through their superiority, through their virtues, through greatness, and by the result and the moralizing influence of their deeds. I'm sure you're quite aware that Spiritism stresses that there's a very important relationship and a balance between intelligence and morality. I say this all the time to people in the English studies group, but we live in an era now in which there's a lot of intelligence, all kinds of technological advances. Now we've got AI, which is having profound effects on society. We've made all kinds of major scientific advances. We've improved morally too, I would argue. But what's the relationship between intelligence and morality? If intelligence is way, way ahead and morality is way down here, that's unstable. The more we can balance intelligence and morality, then things become more stable. After all, criminals are often very intelligent people, but that doesn't mean that we want to follow what they're doing. So a missionary, somebody who's on a genuine mission, again, has a balance, more of a balance, I would say, between intelligence and morality. And as we work on our spiritual progress, we need intelligence to guide us through the journeys we're on, of course. And intelligence helps us to understand and discover all kinds of things. This is what human beings are here to do. It's what we're the only species on this planet capable of increasing our intelligence the way that we do. But we also, of course, have to work on increasing the morality along with it. So this is a general point about that Spiritism stresses a lot, but it's also being stressed here as a way of when we look at somebody and we're trying to figure out, should I follow this person? Is this a prophet, in quotes, somebody who appears to be on a genuine mission? How can I recognize it? Now, there are some, Erastus is a spirit that there are spirit teachings in most chapters in the Gospel according to Spiritism. And here are some of the teachings. Again, I apologize that they don't pop up one by one, but I'll just summarize some of what Erastus was emphasizing in the Gospel according to Spiritism. There's no shortage of false prophets in the spirit world. As you know, there are all kinds of spirits in the spirit world, so we have to use our discernment. This is a reminder. It's perhaps an obvious point to any of us who've been in a Spiritist center for a while, but we always have to be careful about the kinds of advice, impulses, messages we may be getting and where they're really coming from. It mentions that false prophets in the spirit world can often be proud, in other words, arrogant, and they show pretenses of love and charity. Sometimes people come across as being very serene and very spiritual, and maybe they are, but then you have to, again, look at what they're like underneath. Because sometimes people pretend to be serene, but they're really not serene. They actually have another side that pops up from time to time. Now, this Erastus also warns about the way in which false prophets in the spirit world like to sow disunity and delay progress, that they like to sow the seeds of antagonism. So let me give an example through a typical Spiritist center. Hopefully everybody at a Spiritist center is working well, people are communicating with each other, people are mindful of one another, and people respect one another. But if you start seeing people fighting, if you start seeing people starting to not get angry at one another, or maybe I believe so-and-so is doing such and such. In psychology, they call it projection, where I don't really know what the other person is thinking, but I have this opinion as to what they're thinking. Well, when we're doing this, we may be opening ourselves up to spiritual company that wants to exploit that. This is touching on obsession, and put very simply, obsession occurs because we have flaws in our personality that allow spirits to exploit what those flaws are. So if I, for instance, let's say I tend to be paranoid about people. A spirit may be trying to convince me to be paranoid, and I start making all kinds of assumptions about everybody else, and then I behave accordingly. Even though, and I'm not living in reality when I do that. So a false prophet in the spirit world can be one who thrives on antagonism and disunity, which is why in a spiritist center, as in life in general, we always have to be as vigilant as we can to examine how we're reacting to one another. If we have a problem with somebody, can we talk to that person? Are we finding out what's really going on, or are we making all kinds of assumptions? One of the ways in which false prophets really proliferate is when we lock ourselves into certain belief systems or understandings of things and we don't question them. We get into a mindset. Okay. Erastus also advises that genuine spirits, those who work on behalf of the good, they're kind and they're eminently rational. So what he's talking about here is if we get certain ideas or certain beliefs are being floated around, so to speak, do they make sense? Spiritism is again always asking us to use our judgment and use our discernment. By judgment, of course, I mean we're compassionate, but being compassionate doesn't mean you don't observe at the same time. But you have to ask yourself, does this make sense, what I'm hearing, what somebody's advising? And it talks about irrational utopian ideals will not last. So again, there's a strong emphasis here about the importance of science and using discernment via science. Truth will eventually prevail among the majority. It makes little sense that any belief system that sees its adherents diminish is somehow truer than a system that multiplies followers. So if we look at Spiritism as just one of many examples one could come up with, is Spiritism increasing its numbers? If it's increasing, then there's something to it and it's taking root with people. That's the promise of it. But also, this last part, God wants truth to happen to all, not to a small select group. In the book Genesis, it emphasizes that when a movement is happening in the planet, it's happening in multiple locations. It's not only happening in one place. So anytime a group of people think they have the exclusive monopoly on truth, you have to be very cautious about that. Because again, God wants the truth to spread to all of us. Okay. This again is another direct comment about mediumistic meetings in particular. This is a very basic point, but again, it's in relation to not being fooled, which is that when there are communications in mediumistic meetings, we have to use our discernment. During the pandemic, there were certain messages that were getting floated around through WhatsApp groups that people thought were genuine, and then they turned out not to be. So the temptation to circulate a message, oh, we got this message at our center, and look what we just found out. There can be some ego involved in that, which is why we have to take our time. We have to look at what the message is saying and try to verify it before you blast it out into the world. Now, what I just told you may be obvious, but don't we sometimes have that urge to want to share everything with everybody and try to be the first one to reveal something that may catch on? So what this is saying is, again, if we get a message, use our judgment and then decide, is this really something we need to share or not? So I'm going to start to wrap up. Again, one of the general messages of chapter 21 from the Gospel according to Spiritism is that we need to use our discernment. And of course, in using our discernment, we need to take more responsibility. It can be very tempting sometimes to just sit back and let somebody else run the show, so to speak. And we don't have to think. Our leaders will tell us this is how things are, and maybe they're being truthful, or maybe they're being somewhat truthful, or maybe they're not being truthful at all. But citizenship means you have to participate, you have to be informed. And so when we talk about false prophets, we're really talking about distinguishing between what is good and bad. And then it says it was not to become false prophets ourselves. We are gullible, as I mentioned in the beginning, because sometimes we're insecure, sometimes we have a lot of fear, sometimes it just takes a lot of work to have to think all the time, and we just want certain decisions to be made for us. But the more we don't participate in understanding what's happening around us, then the more we make ourselves vulnerable. So really this chapter, to repeat, is stressing that it is our personal responsibility to try to increase our discernment as much as possible, to try to see things as truthfully as we can. And sometimes it gets very frustrating because a lot of times people want clear, simple, straightforward answers, and that's that. They don't like shades of gray. But unfortunately, there are times when the world is very much shades of gray. It's not an absolute truth one way or the other. So we have to learn to be comfortable with that. And that also means that sometimes when it comes to certain decisions that we make, the best thing we can do is wait. Sometimes we act right away, other times we need to wait. As mentioned, many are proud and stubborn. I gave you the example of what happened to the United Kingdom of Israel, how temporarily the kingdom of Israel had been lost because of not following or breaking the covenant with God, rooted in stubbornness, pride, arrogance, and so forth. But it's a warning to any country now. If we traffic in pride, if we are habitually stubborn, then we open ourselves up to creating an environment that can bring about a collapse. But at the same time, if we do our best to be grounded, to use our discernment, we don't have to get entangled in whatever's going on around us. So part of what Jesus advises is if there's conflicts happening and people are getting very riled up, don't get involved with it if you don't need to be. Why? If people want to go, become very unbalanced, what about us? What are we going to do? Are we going to do our best to be as centered as possible? That's an example of following a genuine prophet. And then I love this phrase, the one who endures to the end will be saved. I think Jesus is reminding us that life can be very hard and very frustrating sometimes. And we have to do our best to get through all the difficult moments, periods of uncertainty, periods of doubt. Doubt is normal, by the way. It's okay to have doubt. Part of our path to spiritual advancement is to have doubt. We have to work ourselves through that so that we can then develop a deeper connection and a deeper relationship with faith. And this is part of what it means to also avoid the false prophets, so to speak. Okay, I'd like to thank all of you for listening, and have a good rest of the day.
Tudo bem? Agora voltou aqui para a tecla, né? Português. Tecla SAP. Tudo bem? Tudo certo? Alguma pergunta para o Peter? Ele adora responder perguntas. I ask if there were any questions for you, because you love to answer.
That's true.
Tudo bem, então? Esse é um tema importante, né? Em português haverão falsos cristos e falsos profetas, para a gente prestar atenção, né? E no Evangelho diz, né? Se analisar, né? Ver tudo que vem, se é de Deus. Nós temos que usar o nosso critério, né? Se é de Deus, se é bom, se vai fazer um bem para a humanidade, não só para nós, né? Para a humanidade toda. Será que é bom? Será que é de Deus? A gente tem que usar esse discernimento, né? Para saber. Não é só escutar alguma coisa e falar, vamos lá no Zap Zap e publica, né? Sim, Terezinha. Eu sabia que a Terezinha ia falar com a gente hoje.
Touching this subject of false Christ and false prophets, we that are more in touch with the WhatsApp, how we call the WhatsApp. Yeah, WhatsApp. In Portuguese, we can see so many false prophets, and including lately, Joana de Angelis, Chico Xavier, Divaldo, and others are sending many messages talking about everything, and people believe it. Including spiritists believe it. I don't know if you can see how serious it is. Joana de Angelis is giving opinion what is going to happen to this day. Okay, it's unbelievable. I believe many people here came across this reality. So it's very subtle. So as you said, we can be misled very easily if we don't think and reason.
We have to, really ask ourselves, what am I going to participate in?
Yes, because it's very clear that the intention is destabilize, maybe, I don't know if this word is right, spiritism, discredit spiritism. How can something very low level happen and people have an idea that spiritism agrees with it?
O espírita que acredita numa coisa dessa, ele tem que estudar mais. Ele está precisando estudar, porque ele não está sabendo
But the
espiritismo.
problem is, who is not a spiritist and read the thing? That's the problem.
This is the biggest problem. It's the biggest problem.
Mas isso tem tudo, né?
Common sense, guys. I think the common sense.
A gente tem que estar prestando mais
And
atenção.
come to your own conclusion by your knowledge, by what to know, and by using your common sense. You'll be able to distinguish and know if that makes sense, if it's really true or not. That's the only way how
Would
How you
Divaldo write these things? Would Joana de Angelis be involved in these low-class discussions? Right? We have to think.
Yeah,
You have to have a knowledge
common
to
sense
understand.
will make you realize that
Às vezes eu
Mas
dou
é-
graças a Deus que eu não tenho tempo para ler essas
Também
coisas.
não, mas
Então eu tô graças a Deus.
Mas isso pode ser um ponto positivo. A pessoa que ouve isso, que lê isso, ele vai falar assim, peraí, esse espiritismo é interessante. Vai querer conhecer espiritismo e aprender. Aí vai ver que não é, mas vai ver o lado de outra coisa.
Mas a Alice falou uma coisa importante, né? Eu acho que não é só as pessoas que divulgam que precisam estudar, nós todos precisamos estudar muito, e a casa oferece muitos estudos, quase todos os dias nós temos estudos online, no final de semana a gente está aqui, né? No final de semana, sábado e domingo a gente está aqui, a casa oferece vários estudos, meditação. Durante a semana a gente tem estudo na segunda, na quarta, na quinta, na sexta. Tem estudo para todos os gostos, todos os tipos, em espanhol com a Lucy, em inglês com o Peter, português comigo, com a Terezinha, com a Geilza, no domingo, com a Silma, com a Cibele, com o Nuno. Então, nós temos várias oportunidades, né? Escolher um dia, um diazinho que seja, né? Um dia, uma oportunidade. Só pega uma oportunidade. Você não vai pegar duas, pega uma, né, Tetê? Mas venha, ajude, se ajude, que é bom aprender, né? A gente vai aprender. Então, nós vamos para a nossa segunda parte, para depois ir para a terceira, que é o almoço, que está de primeira. Calma. Beth, você está mesmo com vontade, hein, Beth?
A segunda parte é os passos.
Não, a segunda, não, nós vamos, calma aí, ainda falta oração ainda. Você vai fazer a oração e a oração vai ser a poesia?
Não,
Não é?
Tem a ver com poesia,
Não
com
tem?
oração.
Não é?
O tema não.
Então tá bom. Então eu vou te trazer agora, Beth, você faz, depois eu volto.
É, melhor.
Tá bom? Então vamos lá. Então.
Falando, tem que ser antes da oração.
Vamos ver o que a Beth nos vai presentear.
Eu escrevi no fim do ano porque eu sempre participo de uma coletânea de escritores e eles falam, o tema é viagem. Ah, meu Deus, mas pode ser viagem simbólica, pode ser viagem de todos os aspectos, não precisa ser viagem real. Aí eu escrevi sobre viagem ao redor de si mesmo, né? Viajar para muitos países e cidades é bom, porém não como fuga de si mesmo. A mais difícil viagem é para dentro de nós mesmos. Podemos encontrar defeitos e virtudes, sonhar e também aterrissar na realidade. Seria um autoconhecimento para depois transformar. Ações e reações que temos que não sabíamos. Viajar é descobrir povos, culturas, seres humanos. E nós, como seres humanos, quem somos? Às vezes somos estranhos a nós mesmos. Conhecemos os outros mais que a nós mesmos. E o julgamento? Julgamos e criticamos o que pensamos ser errado nos outros. Mas temos que nos encontrarmos com o nosso espelho, saber o que está errado em nós. Viajar é estar neste planeta tentando nos aperfeiçoar como pessoas, no tempo que Deus nos deu. Tentar ser nós mesmos autênticos sem nos enganarmos. Tentar construir algo de bom para deixar aqui. Sempre evoluir, sempre persistir, sempre amar. Amar a nós mesmos e perdoar a nós mesmos também por nossos erros. Viajar é continuar, sempre ir em frente, mas não esquecer de pedir perdão caso ferirmos alguém ou a nós mesmos. O importante é fazer a viagem interior para acertar no futuro.
Não é bem poema, mas é muito.
É um poema, assim, como não?
A prosa foi.
Não, é muito bom mesmo.
Muito bom, Beth.
Não, é muito bom. Obrigado, Beth.
Cai dentro do tema.
Vai dentro do
Cai.
tema.
Sermos verdadeiros profetas de nós mesmos.
Nós mesmos.
Por isso que eu trouxe a mensagem que tinha a ver.
É isso aí. Então tá bom. Agora nós vamos para a segunda parte, né? Que é os nossos passes. Vão ter os passes depois. Todos estão convidados para o nosso almoço, que está de primeira ali. What do you cook, Peter? Today, Peter, cook everything. Chicken, salmon, rice, vegetable, beans,
Dessert, salad,
dessert,
your pasta.
pasta ao pesto. Então, nós vamos aí para a nossa oração agora, depois nós vamos para o passe. Quem está com vontade de orar, deixa eu ver aqui. Ana Lu, faz tempo que ela não vem aqui orar para a gente. Faz a nossa oração, Ana Lu? Então, tá bom. Que Jesus nos abençoe. Deixa eu colocar isso aqui, peraí.
Vamos, nesse momento, acalmar nossos pensamentos, nosso coração, e perceber todo o amor que está à nossa volta. Neste momento, vamos agradecer a bênção da vida, a bênção da reencarnação e da oportunidade de estarmos recomeçando. Temos a oportunidade de mais um ano aqui no mundo material, onde iremos aprender a relacionar com os nossos irmãos, com as diferenças, agradecendo todos os dias a oportunidade de perdoar, de aprender uns com os outros, de amar, de sermos solidários. Lembrando que a caridade maior que Cristo nos ensina é a benevolência, a indulgência nos erros alheios e o perdão das ofensas. Que nós possamos manter essa caridade sublime em nosso dia a dia, não esquecendo também de toda a caridade essencial àqueles que necessitam do alimento, do abrigo, do remédio. Queremos agradecer a toda a equipe espiritual da Amor Luz, que cuida com tanto carinho de todos os seus membros, e todos aqueles que chegam aqui em sentido de ajuda e de esclarecimento. Que nós possamos nos unir e trabalhar cada vez mais em prol da nossa casa. Que possamos, Senhor, nos amarmos como os irmãos que somos. Queremos agradecer por esta manhã de estudo, por todos os trabalhadores dessa casa que se empenham em diferentes tarefas para semear o amor e a luz. Obrigada, Senhor, que todos nós tenhamos uma semana abençoada.